The sky was still dark when Mia's alarm went off, breaking the silence of the small, dimly lit room. She lay still for a second or two, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and her mother's soft breathing from the next room. Every single part of her body wanted her to shut her eyes again and go back to sleep, but she knew that wasn't any good. She had a full day planned ahead, and sleep was a luxury she could not afford. Grudgingly, Mia slipped out of bed, careful to make no noise. The creaky wood beneath her feet seemed to groan with each silent step she took across the cramped room. Her eyes began to adjust to the dim light that managed to seep through the narrow window. She threw on her old jeans and a t-shirt, then drew her hair back quickly into a ponytail. Her school bag sat waiting by the door. She had packed it the night before going to bed. She looked at the wall clock. It was barely 5:30 a.m. Mia walked into the kitchen, her fingers brushing over chipped countertops as she set out her mother's breakfast. Oatmeal again, she muttered to herself. They've been eating oatmeal for the past few days, and she was getting fed up already. They didn't have much option, but Mia had mastered the art of making a little seem like enough. She stirred the oatmeal till it thickened, then spooned it into a bowl, sprinkling a thin layer of cinnamon on top, a small treat for her mother. Once the meal was ready, Mia entered the room adjoining her own. Her mother, a slender woman with warm brown eyes and a gentle smile, was already awake, looking out the window. She turned as Mia entered, her smile getting wider as she attempted to sit up in her wheelchair. "Morning, Mama," Mia said softly, setting down the tray on a small table beside her mother's chair. "Good morning, sweet pea," her mom replied in a weak but warm voice. "You're up early." "Got to be," Mia said with a slight smile, helping her mom with the oatmeal. "I'll walk you out to the porch after breakfast, okay? I need to get some fresh air before I head to school." Her mother nodded, extending her hand to squeeze Mia's. "I am so lucky to have you, Mia. I wish things were easier for you." Mia just smiled. She'd heard her mother say those words 1,000 times before, and she'd learned to push down the ache that accompanied them. They were all each other had, and Mia was determined to take care of her mother, no matter how tough it got. Once her mom was comfortable at the window, Mia gathered her things, kissed her mother, and stepped outside. The early morning air was cool and damp, with a light drizzle setting in as she started down the narrow, cracked sidewalk that led out of her neighborhood. Mia knew it well enough by now. She'd done the trek to school every day for as long as she could remember. She first ran past rows of houses in various states of disrepair, broken windows, peeling paint. She knew most of the people who lived inside. Most of them were elderly or held multiple jobs. Her mother used to tell her that the neighborhood was once better, but all Mia really saw anymore was tired faces and vacant stares. Mia walked mile after mile. The rain from the previous night had made most of the pathway wet and filled with puddles. The puddles on the sidewalk made Mia's shoes soak up water, and the dampness seeped into her socks. She could feel the chill spread through her toes, but tried to ignore it. She just continued to move forward with her eyes fixed on the horizon. Mia walked faster as she thought of the classes that she was going to miss. Math was the first period, and it was her favorite class because she loved how numbers fitted together, neat, tidy, and always solving themselves if only you knew the right way. Her teacher, Mrs. Roberts, was strict, but Mia knew she was fair even if sometimes she didn't quite understand Mia's situation. Mia hated being late, hated the way it made her feel like she was somehow failing not just herself but her mom, who had always been so proud of her grades. By the time Mia reached the school gates, she was fully drenched. Her shirt clung to her skin, her shoes squished at each step, and the curious gazes followed her as she held her head up high as she walked into the school hallway. The loud clang of the first period bell boomed just as she reached the main hallway. That was all she needed to know, that she was late again. As she sighed deeply in frustration, Mia rushed to Mrs. Roberts' class, hoping she could slip in unobserved. As she turned the knob to the door, praying that nobody would notice her slip in. As the door creaked open, the room fell silent. All heads turned toward her, and she stood at the doorway, wet and exhausted, holding her books close to her chest. Mrs. Roberts stood with her arms across her chest. Mia could already tell she was in for some scolding. Mrs. Roberts was a tall woman with pointed features and an air of authority that commanded attention. Usually, Mia admired her teacher's confidence, but today, standing in the doorway with every eye on her, she felt small and exposed. "Mia," Mrs. Roberts began, the sharpness of her tone echoing in the classroom. "This is the third time this week you have come in late. Do you have an explanation?" Mia's cheeks flared red. She would have liked to explain, to say something that would make some kind of sense of why she was always running so late, but she knew it would only sound like an excuse. Instead, she looked away, feeling the weight of her classmates' eyes on her. I'm sorry," she muttered under her breath. Mrs. Roberts exhaled loudly. Mia could see the disappointment etched across her face. "Being sorry does not change the fact that you keep disrupting my class midway, young lady. I expect you to be on time, just like everyone else here. I can't understand why you've decided to be unserious with your academics. If you want to be a nuisance, that's fine with me. Just don't rub it off on the serious students." The words hurt, and an instant sharp pang of shame hit Mia. She could feel the eyes of her classmates on her. Some looked at her with eyes filled with curiosity. Others were just indifferent and ready to go back to their textbooks. But nobody knew the reason for her lateness, and Mia wasn't planning on telling anyone. Instead, she kept her head down, walking to her seat at the back of the classroom without another word. As the lesson dragged further on, Mia tried to concentrate on Mrs. Roberts' voice and the numbers and formulas that she had come to love so much. But these words sounded very distant today, and her mind was still a little foggy from the stinging reprimand of the teacher. She looked out the window, watching the rain in its thin streams coming down, and for a moment she desperately wanted someone to notice the burden she carried. She knew better than to expect any sympathy. She had long ago learned not to expect anything from anybody. It only brought disappointment. As the class came to an end, Mrs. Roberts called Mia behind after the other students had left. She felt fear in the pit of her stomach because she knew exactly what was coming. "Mia," Mrs. Roberts started in a softer yet firm tone, "I know you are smart, and I know that you can do better than this. But what I need from you right now is consistency in trying to be in class early. Most people believe you're up to no good. Don't prove them right." Mia looked down, nodding mechanically. She wanted to explain that she did the best she could and that each morning was a struggle she had to overcome alone before getting to school. But somehow the words seemed stuck, pressed in some deep part of her throat, and she couldn't say them. Mrs. Roberts released a deep sigh. "All right, you can go now. Just think about what I said, okay?" Mia nodded again, grasping her books tightly as she left the room. As she walked down the hallway, a strange hollowness stirred inside her, an ache that seemed to press on her like a lonely reminder of everything she had to carry. Life lately had been so difficult, and she didn't know how long she could carry the burden that it came with. Mia's gaze was fixed on the floor as she hunched slightly, hoping to filter out the buzz of voices filling the room. She could feel the weight of their stares and hear the faint whispers from a few seats over. Some students glanced at her with mild interest. Others shot her disapproving looks as though her lateness were some kind of personal affront. The maths class had ended, and they were waiting for the chemistry teacher. Her class was a mix of the familiar faces from the group she had grown up with and a few new ones, students who moved into the area within the last few years. Most of them came from families that had the means to keep them supplied with all the essentials: freshly pressed uniforms, new backpacks, and the best gadgets for school. In contrast, Mia felt like an outsider and had always run to catch up with everyone else, even in appearance. She pulled the damp, itchy sweater closer, ignoring the flaking fabric around the cuffs. The sweater had been a gift from her mother when she turned 13, and though it was worn in patches, it was still good enough to keep her warm for cold mornings like this. She turned her attention to her notebook as she tried to go through the last class with the chemistry teacher as they waited. After teaching Mia's class, Mrs. Roberts continued with the mathematics lesson for the next class. Her voice was brisk and businesslike as she went along with the equations on the board. She was a no-nonsense teacher whose standards were high. Likewise, her routine in class was sound and strict. She expected the same amount of discipline and punctuality from all her students. Most of her students respected her for that, but today Mrs. Roberts couldn't help but think of what was going on with Mia. She knew the girl was smart, but she had started lagging behind in schoolwork for months now. To Mrs. Roberts, Mia was a bundle of mystery. But she knew that this quiet and introspective student had so much untapped potential that was yet to be harnessed due to inconsistency. For her, Mia's chronic lateness was due to disobedience and poor planning, and it was a nonsensical choice that was starting to disrupt the timing of her perfectly choreographed class routine. Mrs. Roberts turned back to the board, moving her hand swiftly as she wrote out the next equation. Mrs. Roberts felt that Mia wasn't trying hard enough and that she could do better if she just made an effort. She shook her head, trying to focus on the class she was teaching, making up her mind to speak with her again after the class she was handling now. As the chemistry lecture carried on, Mia couldn't help but notice the stares of some other students. There was Eliza, a girl with thick curly hair and a bright yellow jacket who sat 2 rows in front. Eliza was one of the few students ever to be nice to Mia. She'd smiled at Mia once or twice and had even offered her half of her sandwich on a day when Mia had forgotten her lunch. Today, however, Eliza's gaze held a hint of curiosity and perhaps a little bit of concern. She looked as though she wanted to say something but wasn't sure whether it was her place. Across the room, a boy who sat next to the windows raised an eyebrow at her as he passed a note across to his friend. The look on his face was clear, and Mia knew exactly what it insinuated. Adam was one of those students who always performed well, and he was the teacher's favorite due to his sharp wit and fast responses. She had once overheard him whisper to others that people like Mia do not care about school. The words had hurt her more than she liked to admit, and despite the fact that she tried to convince herself that he didn't mean any harm with it, the words seemed to hang in the darkness of her mind, echoing when the night grew late, and she was lying awake, trying to understand if others felt precisely the same way. But how could Mia waste any more time defending or explaining her reality to other people when she was already exhausted before she even got to school? Mia stared into her notebook, her pen poised over the page, pretending to focus on the lesson. Outside the classroom, gray clouds sagged low in the sky, casting an ominous shadow over the school courtyard. She could see a few kids huddled under umbrellas, laughing and talking as they made their way across to the cafeteria. Nothing sounded better than that, to be outside in the cold but beautiful weather. But something in her knew she'd never really belong. She didn't have stories about weekend trips or new phones. She didn't have a car to take her to school or a parent who could drive her. She was leading such a different life from theirs, and sometimes it just felt like she was from another world. As the chemistry lesson went on, Mia's mind began to wander. She thought about her mother, all alone at home, her wheelchair parked by the small window looking out onto their street. Mia was ever concerned about her mother's health, the bills that piled up, and the burden of responsibilities that felt too heavy for a young shoulder. She wished there was someone she could talk to, someone who might understand what her life was really like. But Mia knew better than to hope for that kind of understanding. She had learned early that people liked simple explanations, and her reality was anything but simple. It was layered with responsibilities, sacrifices, quiet resilience, and several things she felt her classmates could hardly understand. As the chemistry lesson came to an end, she caught sight of Mrs. Roberts by the door. She gestured to the chemistry teacher, and they spoke for a few minutes before he left. Mrs. Roberts stepped into the class and asked the class to settle down. She had forgotten to give them some problems to solve for the weekend. She turned her back to the wall and wrote out a list of maths exercises for the children to complete at home. Her eyes swept around the room, resting on Mia for a split second. "Mia," Mrs. Roberts called softly but gravely. "May I see you for a minute?" Mia's stomach twisted. She looked around the room as her classmates started to file out, some of them giving her curious looks. Eliza gave her a small, sympathetic smile as she left, and Adam snickered to his friend as he walked out. But she just ignored them. She tried to prepare herself, trying to hold down the rising feeling of fear. Mrs. Roberts finally spoke when everyone else was cleared of the room. Mia noticed that her voice was softer, yet it carried a firmness that again kept Mia on her toes. "Mia?" she started, her brow furrowing as she searched for words. "I know it may not be easy to always be on time, but you're a bright girl, and I'd hate to see you being left behind because of lateness. Does something bother you, so you can't get to school on time?" Mia's heart was racing in her chest. Part of her wanted to open up and tell Mrs. Roberts about her mother, how she spent her mornings making breakfast for the both of them, tidying the house and dressing up her mother before the extremely long walk to school. Still, another part of her would not even let her voice the truth. She did not want any pity or special treatment. All she wanted was to be seen just like any other student, one who was trying her best. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Roberts," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the floor. I'll try harder to be on time." Mrs. Roberts let out a sigh, and for a moment, Mia could see the frustration on her face. "I appreciate that, Mia. I really do. I just want to make sure you understand how important it is. If you need any help tutoring or anything, don't hesitate to ask. I'm here for you." Mia nodded and gave a small, polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. A soft, "Thank you," escaped her lips as she quickly gathered her things and slipped out of the classroom. She could feel Mrs. Roberts's gaze following her as she walked away, but she didn't look back. She walked to the cafeteria for lunch, catching a few stares as usual from other students whispering as she passed by. She grasped her backpack a little bit tighter as her cheeks burned under their scrutiny. She wanted to tell them that she wasn't so different, that she dreamed and struggled just like everybody else. But she knew they would never understand, and they wouldn't unless they took her place. Mia found a quiet corner of the cafeteria, pulled out a small sandwich she'd made that morning, and ate in silence, watching the groups of friends around her, laughing and sharing stories. She felt the familiar ache of loneliness settle over her, but she pushed it aside, focusing instead on finishing her meal before the bell rang for the next class. As the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Mrs. Roberts stood at her desk and watched the students gather their things and discuss as they moved toward the door. Mia was one of the last to leave, slipping out quietly, her expression distant and tired. Mrs. Roberts's gaze lingered on the empty doorway for a moment after Mia disappeared, a faint crease forming between her brows. This feeling just wouldn't let her be that something was wrong with Mia. Ever since their brief conversation that morning, Mrs. Roberts had been mulling over the girl's evasive response. Mia had, of course, apologized and promised to try harder, but there was something in the girl's expression, something almost defensive, that tugged at Mrs. Roberts' mind. It wasn't like Mrs. Roberts to get into a student's personal life. She was known as a strict teacher, but at the same time, she was a mother, and she could tell when something was wrong with a child. Throughout her time teaching, she tried to keep her distance from her students' affairs when outside the classroom. But there was a quiet sadness in Mia's eyes, a weight she seemed to carry. And that was something Mrs. Roberts couldn't afford to ignore. All the walls of professional detachment she had built up were suddenly breached. Mrs. Roberts eyed the pile of ungraded papers on her desk and felt a tinge of guilt. She had been tough on Mia, perhaps even a little bit harsh with her words. The way Mia looked down with a kind of quiet strength in her eyes, despite her reprimand, left an impression. She let out a sigh as she gathered her things and walked out of the classroom with an odd sense of discomfort. Mrs. Roberts caught sight of Mia's messy ponytail way down the corridor, heading towards the exit. The school was already half empty, with kids spilling out of classrooms and heading home for the day. Mrs. Roberts worked her way through the crowd as quietly as possible. Mia had her head down as if she was oblivious to the crowd and noise of students around her. An idea struck Mrs. Roberts' mind. At first, she tried to put it off. "Impossible," she muttered to herself. But on second thought, she found that there was no harm in it. She suddenly found herself wondering where Mia went each day after school, what she encountered on her way home, and why she was always so tired when she arrived at school in the morning. Mrs. Roberts was determined not to change her mind. She hitched the strap of her bag over her shoulder, trusting her instincts as she left the school building slowly behind Mia. The sky was already gray outside, heavy clouds looming overhead, and it was obvious the rain was going to fall again. Mia seemed oblivious to her surroundings. Her gait was as steady as she walked down the sidewalk. Mrs. Roberts stayed about a block behind her, her steps quiet in the hope that she would go unnoticed. A faint sense of guilt pricked at the back of her mind. She wasn't one to invade a student's privacy, but something about the situation was wrong, and she was going to figure it out. As Mia turned the corner, Mrs. Roberts hastened her pace, her eyes scanning the street for any sign of the girl. She finally spotted her walking along the side of the road, her shoulders hunched against the chilly breeze. Mrs. Roberts followed at a safe distance, her curiosity growing with each step. Mia took a busy road, the kind that was lined up with fast food restaurants and gas stations, where cars whizzed by without anyone's head turning in their direction. And Mrs. Roberts couldn't help but feel the skepticism build in her stomach as she watched Mia make her way down the shoulder of the road. They had been walking for some minutes now, and it looked like Mia wasn't even about to reach her destination. The route Mia had taken was long and meandering, much longer than Mrs. Roberts could have ever imagined. She suddenly realized that Mia wasn't just walking a few blocks. In fact, she was walking miles, and the only company she had was the cacophony of traffic and the rushes of the wind. Mrs. Roberts shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her as the first drops of rain began falling. How often does she do this? Mrs. Roberts found herself wondering as she watched Mia's small frame moving resolutely through the dampening air. Every day? In this cold weather? The drizzling of the rain was starting to get heavier. Mrs. Roberts instinctively quickened her pace, her eyes fixed on Mia. The girl didn't even flinch at the changing weather, the obvious rain seeping into her clothes. Mia just kept moving as if to stop would be a bad choice. Mrs. Roberts could feel the chill beginning to seep into her skin, and she couldn't even imagine how Mia must feel in that thin, worn sweater with no umbrella protection from the weather. The more they walked, the more the confusion on Mrs. Roberts's face turned to a mixture of astonishment and concern. This was not the route of a student who simply would not get a ride, or had missed the school bus. She could tell this was not the first time Mia had walked this route. It was obvious from her gait that it was a deeply ingrained routine already. After almost half an hour, Mia took a turn off the main road onto a quiet, narrow street filled with small houses in a state of disrepair. Mrs. Roberts lagged a little as she fought to drag her foot forward. Her eyes scanned the neighborhood. Many of the houses were in terrible states, with chipped paint, broken fences, and overgrown yards. It was a part of town Mrs. Roberts rarely visited, but she had heard stories of how bad the neighborhood was. However, it seemed worse than the stories she had heard. The stark contrast with her own comfortable neighborhood struck Mrs. Roberts for the first time. Mia stopped in front of one of the smallest houses in the street, a single-story house with paint gone and a sagging roof. Weeds overgrew the front yard, and the steps leading up onto the porch were worn and splintered. Mia ran quietly towards the house. Mrs. Roberts watched her fiddle carefully with the lock on the front door before disappearing inside. Mrs. Roberts just stood there in the rain, staring at the house, her mind reeling with questions. She didn't know what she'd expected, but the reality of Mia's home struck her with an intensity she hadn't anticipated. Mia's life was obviously starkly different from the lives of most of her other students, whose parents picked them up in cars, who went home to clean, brightly lit homes full of warmth and security. Just as she was about to turn away, something caught her eye. A woman by the windowsill in the house Mia had just entered was thin and frail-looking. Her face was partially obscured by the faded curtains, but Mrs. Roberts could make out the hollow in her cheeks. She had the same warm brown eyes as Mia, and as Mrs. Roberts peered closer, she realized the woman was in a wheelchair. As Mrs. Roberts thought about it, she started to piece it all together. She understood the reality of Mia's life. It suddenly all made sense. The lateness, the exhaustion, the guarded expression Mia wore like armor every day. She was taking care of her mother, a woman who was clearly suffering with her health, confined to a wheelchair in a house that seemed to be barely holding itself together. The emotions that welled up made Mrs. Roberts's vision blur, the weight of realization hitting her with a force that was unexpected. She'd been so quick to judge Mia, to immediately think that her running late just proved her laziness or irresponsibility. She had never once thought that Mia could be carrying a load far heavier than any child should have to carry. Mrs. Roberts' eyes welled with tears, and she let them fall as her heart ached with guilt and regret. She replayed in her mind the harsh words she had spoken to Mia, the disappointment in her tone, and how Mia had lowered her head as she accepted the criticism without uttering a word in protest. Now Mrs. Roberts realized that Mia's silence had been one of strength, shielding her from the pain brought about by judgment, concealing the struggle she went through day in and day out. Mrs. Roberts stood outside for some moments with her hands balled into fists as the rain began to fall. Her mind was racing, swirling with emotions. She stood there as the rain soaked her completely, washing away the tears from her eyes. One thing she knew was that something needed to be done now. She needed to find some way to help Mia and support her in a way greater than within the confines of the classroom. Mrs. Roberts finally took a deep, shaky breath and started her car, pulling away from Mia's street with a newfound determination. She knew exactly what she was going to do now. She would talk to the school administration and find a way to get Mia the support she needed. She would make sure that Mia's silent struggle wasn't ignored anymore, and that her quiet resilience was answered with compassion and understanding. The walk back brought a settled sense of purpose over Mrs. Roberts, inextricably mixed with lingering sadness and regret. She had been blind to Mia's reality, and it had taken this painful revelation to open her eyes. Now, though, she was determined to make amends, bridge the gap between her world and that of Mia. and let the young girl know she was not alone. For the first time in a long time, Mrs. Roberts felt the true weight of responsibility that came with teaching. It was not about academics, but also about understanding and seeing beyond the exterior of your students and being kind to those most in need. Later that evening, Mrs. Roberts sat at her kitchen table, staring blankly at the cold cup of tea in front of her. The house was quiet, and the comforting feeling she usually got from being home seemed distant, almost hollow. Her mind replayed over and over the scene she had just experienced. The small woman in the wheelchair, the look of exhaustion on Mia's face as she approached the dilapidated house, and the exhausting walk home in the rain. Mrs. Roberts had come to see herself as someone who was just, consistent, and sympathetic. She had always thought of herself as a teacher who treated each student equally, one who didn't allow personal judgments to interfere with her professional duties. But as she sat in her kitchen, she began to see the limits of her own understanding, which hurt in a way she hadn't anticipated. Mrs. Robertson had initially thought that Mia was late because she was not making her priorities right, maybe even being neglectful. She had not paused to think that Mia might be fighting battles that were not visible to the naked eye. Now, as she tried to face the reality regarding Mia's home life, Mrs. Roberts was ashamed to her core. How many times had she scolded Mia and embarrassed her before the class? How many times had she seen the tired eyes of that girl and thought only of her anger that she was disrupting her class? She recalled how Mia had cast her head low, the quiet acceptance in her response, and now knew that was not a sign of disrespect at all, but a resilience, hard-earned strength born from necessity. Mrs. Roberts sat in the dark kitchen, remembering when she was a little girl herself. She hadn't grown up with wealth or privilege, but there had always been love, guidance, and the security of a family unit given by her parents. And she had never felt that kind of responsibility that Mia carried, nor knew what it was to carry the weight of someone else when she was barely old enough to take care of herself. Along with the realization came a pang of regret that settled in her chest. She'd been so blind, allowing her assumptions to color her view of Mia, filtering everything through the lens of judgment rather than compassion. The fact was, Mia had been doing her best all along. Mrs. Roberts hadn't seen it. She had seen only what she wanted to see, a student who did not live up to her standards. She felt her cheeks flush, this time with shame mingled with determination. It was a bitter pill to swallow. For the first time, she knew she had acted wrong, and there was nothing she could do to change it. All she could do was make it right and find a way to show Mia that she wasn't alone and that someone cared enough to see beyond the surface. Mrs. Roberts arrived at school early the next morning, her mind already racing with all the different plans and possibilities. She knew she had to talk with the administration about Mia's situation and explore all avenues for support. The guilt weighed heavy on her heart, compelling her toward steps she hadn't considered before. Mrs. Roberts stormed into the office the very moment the administrative unit opened up, her steps driven by purpose. She knew she might be overstepping her boundaries, but something ate away at her conscience and wouldn't let her keep quiet any longer about Mia's struggle. Mrs. Roberts entered the office and approached the school counselor, Ms. Jacobs. She found her sorting files at her desk. Ms. Jacobs looked up, surprised to see Mrs. Roberts at this hour. "Good morning, Mrs. Roberts," Ms. Jacobs said to her, raising an eyebrow. "Is everything all right?" Mrs. Roberts took in a deep breath, composing herself before answering. "Good morning, Ms. Jacobs. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about one of my students. Her name is Mia Johnson. I believe she might need some assistance." Ms. Jacobs placed the pile of files on her desk, her expression changing from politeness and curiosity to one of concern. "Of course, Mrs. Roberts. What kind of assistance are we talking about?" Mrs. Roberts continued, I just found out that Mia's mother is disabled and is in a wheelchair. Mia has been taking care of her mother every morning before she comes to school, and I think she's also been walking a few miles every day to get here, which explains why she's always exhausted during classes. A flicker of sadness crossed Ms. Jacobs' face as she listened to the information being given. Her hands were folded on the desk. That's quite a lot for any young girl to handle. I can't imagine how she's been managing all this on her own. The painful part of the entire situation is that I didn't know, Mrs. Roberts said, almost in a whisper. I didn't know. I have been so preoccupied with her lateness and her performance in class that I didn't think of what she could be facing at home. I feel quite ashamed, really. Ms. Jacobs nodded, a sympathetic smile softening her features. It's easy to overlook these things, Mrs. Roberts. Students just don't always share what's happening in their personal lives. But the fact that you noticed and came forward says a lot. Now that we know, we can find a way to support her. Mrs. Roberts was relieved by Ms. Jacobs' response. Do you think we could arrange for transportation for her? Maybe a bus or some kind of school assistance? Ms. Jacobs nodded contemplatively. I believe we can. We have some resources for situations like this, but we'll need to speak with the principal and see what we can arrange. I'll bring it up at the staff meeting later today and make sure we prioritize this. As Mrs. Roberts left the counselor's office, a wave of relief washed over her. It had been a first step towards helping Mia, and even though she knew that wouldn't wipe clean her past mistakes, at least it was a beginning. She hoped that Mia might come to see her as more than just the teacher who had judged her too quickly. She trusted she would earn her trust and show her that someone did care enough to help her carry this burden she had carried alone. As Mrs. Roberts taught her class that day, she found herself looking at Mia with a new light of understanding. Her tone was softer, warmer than it had been, and though she tried her best to be more kind to Mia, it seemed she didn't even appear to notice. As the math class came to an end and the students started filing out, Mrs. Roberts delayed a little to have a conversation with Mia. As Mia was gathering her books into her faded school bag, Mrs. Roberts came near her with a soft expression. Mia, she said softly, catching her attention. I just wanted to know, if you ever need help with anything at all, I'm here. Mia looked up, her eyes widened as her gaze met Mrs. Roberts's. There was a flicker of uncertainty, almost as if she felt that Mrs. Roberts probably wasn't being genuinely serious with her offer. For a moment, Mia simply stared at her, as though weighing the sincerity of her words. Thank you, Mrs. Roberts, Mia replied quietly, her voice little more than a whisper. I appreciate it. Mrs. Roberts gave her a small, encouraging smile and bit back the urge to say more. She wanted to tell Mia that help was on the way and that soon she wouldn't have to make the long, exhausting walk each morning. But she held back, her sensitive nature warning that Mia's pride was as much a part of her strength as her resilience. Instead, she simply nodded, hoping her being there could say a lot to Mia about not being alone in anything she was going through. As Mrs. Robertson got ready for bed that night, she remembered her conversation with Ms. Jacobs and Mia's silent appreciation. She felt a change inside herself, a growth she never anticipated. She had come to see teaching as just about giving homework and solely focusing on academics. But now, she was starting to learn it was not just about academics, but also about considering her students as whole individuals with their own battles and powers. For the first time in a long while, Mrs. Roberts found herself learning from her students just as much as they were from her. And in that realization, a fire of purpose had been lit inside her, a quiet determination to make a difference, not only in Mia's life, but in the life of every student who walked through the school halls. She slept calmly that night, serene in the thought that there was indeed so much to be done. But she was prepared for all this, even bridging the gap between her and Mia's world. She was prepared to stand next to Mia through all of this and offer her support and understanding, but most of all, her compassion. The following day was not a school day, and Mrs. Roberts sat in her living room, enveloped by the comforting familiarity of her home. But tonight, the warmth seemed so dull. Even the soft hum of the television in the background did not have much of a calming effect on her thoughts, and the soft radiance of the lamp somehow seemed too bright, too cheerful, for the heaviness in her heart. She still couldn't shake her thoughts and worry away from Mia. She had always taken pride in her work as a teacher, in knowing that somehow she was making a difference. Yet her encounter with Mia unraveled all her presumptions and made her question how many other students she had similarly misjudged. She felt as though she'd failed to uphold her own standards of fairness and compassion. Mrs. Roberts still couldn't forget Mia's facial expression from the day when she had offered help in any way. Her sunken eyes, the slight quiver in her voice as she thanked Mrs. Roberts for her offer of help. And there was a guardedness in Mia's face that hinted at disbelief, as if this notion of someone really being concerned about her well-being was foreign to her. That look had stayed with Mrs. Roberts, haunting her, silently reminding her of her own shortcomings. As she sat there, Mrs. Roberts let herself confront the uncomfortable truth that she might have been biased in her views about Mia. Through her teaching experience, she had silently come to view most black students as less serious than their white counterparts. But she knew this way of thinking was wrong. Her bias and assumptions had played a role in downplaying what Mia was going through. She had assumed that Mia was not taking her schoolwork seriously. Her assumptions about Mia's lateness and exhaustion in class were wrong, and she was ready to do anything to right her wrong. Mia had shattered that way of thinking for her, exposing a reality that Mrs. Roberts had not seen. How many times have I judged her? She thought to herself, the guilt heavy in her chest. How many times have I been too quick to interpret her silence as indifference? Her mind turned to the specific moments like the day she'd singled Mia out for having missed an assignment, never knowing that Mia might have been too tired from taking care of her mother, or one of the many times when she'd dismissed Mia's exhaustion as a lack of effort rather than the results of such a grueling routine each morning. Mrs. Roberts felt her face flush with shame. She realized that the place from which those assumptions came was wrong. She had based her thinking on nothing more than the color of Mia's skin, and that assumption had blinded her to the quiet suffering of a young girl simply doing her best. Mrs. Roberts let her breath go, and the weight of the guilt settled into something else, something stronger, a sense of determination. She could not turn back the hands of time, nor blot out the words she'd spoken, nor the disappointment that she'd given into. But she could try to make amends. She could be the teacher Mia was supposed to have, the one who looked beyond the surface, who cared enough to understand even when understanding required effort. This new purpose filled her with an energy she hadn't felt in years. She would be more attentive and more compassionate, and she'd be making sure Mia and students like her felt seen and supported. As a teacher and a human being, she had an obligation to build a safe space where her students felt safe and valued. The following morning, Mrs. Roberts was one of the first teachers to arrive at school just as the stream of students began to pour into the corridors of the buildings. She passed through bustling corridors, taking note of her students as she passed by. There was Adam, who was always fidgety and talking in class. She had assumed that he was always finding ways to seek attention because he probably wasn't getting enough home. She saw Eliza, who was normally quiet and attentive, but often with a distant look. As she glanced at the students in the corridor, she felt each of them had silent stories, all their own, each of which deserved her respect and understanding. That afternoon, Mrs. Roberts worked up the courage to go and see Principal Turner. She knew standing up for Mia was only the first step, but it was one she planned to execute with a lot of determination. She didn't want Mia's struggles to go unnoticed, and she was hopeful that with a joint effort, they could find some kind of way to make her life easier. The principal's office was plain, lined with rows of neatly arranged binders and a small potted plant on the windowsill. Principal Turner himself was middle-aged, with already graying hair. Despite being the highest authority in the school, Mrs. Roberts always felt comfortable around him because he had the kindest smile she had ever seen. He gave her a sweet smile as she walked in, looking up from his paperwork and gesturing to a chair. "Afternoon, Mrs. Roberts," he said with a nod. "What can I do for you today?" Mrs. Roberts took a seat and composed herself before she spoke. "I wanted to talk to you about one of my students, Mia Johnson," she began, her voice serious. She's going through some challenges that I think we need to address." Principal Turner leaned forward. His expression turned reflective as he said, "I see. Tell me more." Mrs. Roberts repeated everything she had learned, from Mia's long walk to school to the responsibilities she shouldered at home, caring for her mother. She described the daily barriers she faced, the lack of resources, and what it seemed to be taking from her emotionally, physically, and academically. As she spoke, Principal Turner listened intently, nodding along, his expression one of empathy. When she was done, he took a moment to collect his thoughts before responding. "That's quite a lot for a young girl to manage," he said quietly. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Mrs. Roberts. We'll do everything we can to support her." Mrs. Roberts let out a sigh of relief. She was thankful that the principal was understanding of her plight. "I was hoping we could arrange transportation for her," she added. "It might sound small, but I think it will make a difference big for her." Principal Turner nodded again. "We do have a few resources for situations like this. I'll speak with the transportation coordinator to see if we can work out a bus route that would pick Mia up. And let's look into additional support too. I'll talk to Ms. Jacobs to see what we can do to provide extra tutoring or whatever else might be helpful." The principal's words were exactly what the doctor ordered for Mrs. Roberts's. She felt a little bit lighter, and the crushing weight of her guilt seemed to get lighter. It was the first time that, in years of fighting guilt, she felt that perhaps she was finally making things right. As Mrs. Roberts came out of Principal Turner's office, she was happy with the outcome, but she knew she had to do more. She knew that Mia's life wouldn't magically change overnight, but she knew these small steps would alleviate her burdens bit by bit. She wanted Mia to know she was not alone, and that there were people in her corner helping her with the baggage she had been carrying over her head for so long. The following morning, Mrs. Roberts saw Mia in the corridor before class. The girl's shoulders was collapsed as if she had been defeated even before her day had started. Her eyes were weary, but determined, her books clutched tightly against her chest. Mrs. Roberts felt a pang of compassion as she watched Mia find her way through the crowded hallway, silently threading her way through students who barely spared her a glance. Mrs. Roberts walked over and laid a light touch on Mia's shoulder, slowly turning her around. Mia looked up, her eyes widening slightly in surprise. "Mia," Mrs. Roberts said, her voice warm and soft. "How are you holding up? I saw you walking to school the other day, and I've put in a word with the school administration. We're working on arranging transportation for you. Soon, you won't have to walk so far every morning. And if you ever need anything, extra help with your schoolwork, or just someone to talk to, please don't hesitate to come to me." Mrs. Roberts had tried her best to avoid telling Mia that she had followed her all the way home, that she had seen the terrible neighborhood she lived in, and that she had seen her sick mom because she knew how proud Mia was. She wasn't going to accept any pity. Mia's eyes flickered. her face a surprised mask that melted to softness as if processing the shocking kindness of Mrs. Roberts's words. She nodded, a very small smile playing on her lips. "Thanks, Mrs. Roberts," she said in a barely audible murmur. At that moment, Mrs. Roberts saw her truly. It was still a fragile bond, but she prayed it would get stronger in due time. She knew Mia was still shutting herself away from people and was still guarded about trusting anybody, but Mrs. Roberts hoped her actions would speak louder than words, and pretty soon, Mia would see her as an ally. Lying in bed that night, Mrs. Roberts reflected on her day with a peace that had long eluded her. She knew this journey with Mia had changed her and forced her to confront assumptions she'd carried that were wrong. It had also shown her some ways she had failed to see her students. She thought of the other students in her class, each of them having a story of their own, a struggle of their own. She vowed to enter each of these relationships with the same compassion and understanding, striving to be one of those few teachers who looked beyond mere surface things into the hearts of her students and gave them the help they needed. Mrs. Roberts went to bed that night in a hopeful mood. It was the most hopeful she had felt in months, perhaps longer, a feeling that she might be able to make a difference, one small act at a time, not only in Mia's life, but also in the lives of all of the other students who passed through her door. The following morning, Mrs. Roberts breezed into her classroom, placing her notes on the desk to get ready for the lesson of the day. There was something in the air today. Maybe it was the expectation in her heart that today would be a turning point. She had carried the burden of her guilt, along with her determination, for many days now, and she knew it was time to confront it face to face with Mia. As the bell rang, signaling the students to flood into the classroom, Mrs. Roberts's eyes landed on Mia as she silently slipped into her chair at the back. Something was different today about Mia, but Mrs. Roberts couldn't pinpoint what it was. Mrs. Roberts knew it was now or never. She needed to reach out and bridge the distance between them. After the class had finally settled and the day's math lesson had started, Mrs. Roberts found herself stealing glances in Mia's direction, trying to find the right words for the conversation she had been practicing since last night. She'd gone over it many times in her head, but nothing felt good enough to say. How could she put words to the feelings of regret as she now understood the struggles Mia faced each day? Finally, the bell rang, signaling the end of the lesson. As the students filed out of the room, Mrs. Roberts called out, "Mia, could you stay back for a moment, please?" Mia faltered, looking quickly around her to check if she had done anything wrong. Her classmates were too caught up in talking and gathering their things to listen to what was being said around them. Mia slowly nodded, her eyes cautious as she went to the front of the room, clinging tightly to the books on her chest. Mrs. Roberts took a deep breath and gave herself a minute to collect her thoughts. She turned to Mia, who stood stiffly, her bright eyes shining with a guarded expression that impressed and saddened her at the same time. "Mia," she said softly, her tone far softer than it had been in a very long time. "I wanted to talk to you about how I've spoken to you in the past." Mia looked down, her shoulders stiffening a bit as if bracing herself for another reprimand. The sight made Mrs. Roberts's heart ache because she could feel how Mia was used to being misunderstood and to shouldering the blame without protest. "I owe you an apology," Mrs. Roberts continued, her voice breaking slightly with emotion. "I realize that I judged you far too quickly, or that I assumed what your life was like instead of really understanding what goes on with you every day. I didn't stop to think of what you might be going through, and for that I am really sorry." Mia's head came up a little, her eyes wide with surprise. She stared at Mrs. Roberts. The expression on her face was jumbled all over the place. Confusion, disbelief, and even a flash of that vulnerability that she rarely showed. "You don't have to apologize, Mrs. Roberts," Mia whispered. "I know I have been late, and I know it must be frustrating every time I disrupt the class. I just don't want to be any burden." The words cut deep, and Mrs. Roberts could feel the well of emotion rise into her chest. She realized, with pang after pang, that Mia had internalized the blame and had come to see herself as a burden rather than a young girl carrying an overwhelming responsibility. "You're no burden, Mia," Mrs. Roberts said, her voice firm and her tone silent with conviction. "Let me make this quite clear. You're an exemplary young woman, and the manner in which you confront everything daily is truly an inspiration, not just to your peers, but also to me. I'm extremely sorry it has taken me this long to realize that." For a moment, Mia just stared at her, as if waiting for some sign that the words were real. Mrs. Roberts waited, giving her space to process her emotions, hoping that she would be able to sense her sincerity. At last, Mia nodded, her lips curling into a small, tentative smile. "Thank you," Mia whispered, her voice thick with emotion. It means a lot to hear you say that." A feeling of relief washed over Mrs. Roberts, and she felt the strengthening of the fragile bond between them, a thread of trust that she hoped would grow with time. She knew words alone couldn't change everything, but she did hope this apology would be the beginning of a new chapter in their relationship, one built on understanding and mutual respect. "There's something more," said Mrs. Roberts softly. "The school is finalizing the transport plan to assist you in getting here in the mornings. It will mean a great deal to me that you can attend school without having to make a very long, tiring walk day after day. If you need anything, Mia, please do not hesitate to ask. I am here to help you." Mia's eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked as though she might protest, a flicker of pride flashing in her gaze. She wondered how Mrs. Roberts had found out about the long walk she made each day to get to school. She wanted to ask, but to what end, she wondered. Mia simply nodded, a quiet acceptance settling over her. Mrs. Roberts could see the weight lift from Mia's shoulders. Even if it was only a little help, she knew just how relieved Mia was. "Thank you, Mrs. Roberts," Mia whispered, her voice barely audible above silence. I didn't think anyone noticed." Those words struck deep within Mrs. Roberts, and her eyes welled up with tears. She finally realized how much Mia had been carrying around in complete silence, and how utterly alone she must have felt, fighting her way through a world that seemed to care so little. "I'm so sorry it took me such a long time to notice," Mrs. Roberts said softly. "But I see you now, Mia, and I am so proud of you." Mia nodded, her eyes blinking rapidly to keep the tears away. She smiled slightly, then turned to gather her books and moved towards the door. As she left, Mrs. Roberts felt a renewal of purpose, a commitment to being the teacher not just Mia deserved, but every one of her students. Over the next several days, a quiet readjustment of their relationship and respect took place. At school, Mrs. Roberts could note that Mia walked more confidently now, without her shoulders weighted down. She wasn't alone quite as often, and though she was still self-isolating, there was a quiet confidence in the way she carried herself that indicated the reassurance from Mrs. Roberts had lightened part of her burden. It was also obvious that she was being more active and energetic in class. The transportation arrangement had been finalized, and she no longer had to walk long distances to school. The other kids started to take notice too. Eliza, the girl who occasionally shared her lunch with Mia, invited her to sit at her table in the cafeteria. Mia sat down with a shy smile. Bit by bit, the walls around Mia began to break down, and she seemed more receptive to the warmth that others were beginning to show her. Later that week, after their maths period, Mia decided to hang back after class to speak with Mrs. Roberts. She approached Mrs. Roberts's desk with an uncertain glint in her eyes. "Mrs. Roberts?" she said softly. Mrs. Roberts looked up, beaming bright. "Yes, Mia?" Mia seemed to quiver like a leaf, searching for words that she hoped would fit what she felt. "I just wanted to say thank you. Not just for the transportation, but for everything. For understanding. I didn't think anyone would care." Mrs. Roberts' heart swelled with emotion, and she reached out, gently squeezing Mia's hand. "Mia, I care very much, and let me make something clear to you. You are not alone. You have people present here who want to help you, who want to see you succeed. You deserve that." Mia smiled. It was a genuine smile that lit up her entire face, and in that instant, Mrs. Roberts saw a young girl with dreams and hopes, a girl who had been through so much that any child her age should never have to go through. She knew this was far from over, but she did know one thing now. Mia had people around her who cared, people who would be willing to stand beside her. "Thank you," Mia said again, soft but full of sincerity. "That means a lot." Mrs. Roberts felt satisfied as the school day concluded, and Mia went on her way home. She knew this new connection with Mia was giving her a new sense of purpose, reminding her why she took up teaching in the first place. It wasn't about just equations or homework. It was about seeing her students as breathing, living, struggling little human beings, and trying everything possible to help them succeed outside these walls of education. She knew she had messed up, that she'd judged Mia and let her own prejudices cloud her judgment. Still, she was grateful for a second chance to get it right, to be able to show Mia that there was at least one person in this world who cared and believed in her. As she watched Mia walk down the hallway, her head held high, Mrs. Roberts felt a sense of hope that perhaps this small act of kindness would give Mia the strength she needed to continue forward, knowing she was not alone. Very early the next morning, Mrs. Roberts headed to school, bound and determined to get the help Mia needed beyond simple transportation each day. While she was quite relieved that Mia now had a way of getting to school without having to make such a long, exhausting walk, she knew Mia's situation called for far more extensive assistance. Given the burdens Mia was experiencing at home, the burden of her responsibility, and the problem she had with limited resources, this would have to be handled by a team of people, which would require help from the administration and counselors at the school, and, if possible, community outreach. At the first bell, Mrs. Roberts walked down the hallways slowly. She was greeted with the sound of lockers banging and students discussing and laughing in groups. She went down to the main office to meet the principal of the school and the counselor she had spoken with earlier. Principal Turner sat at his desk in the inner office, sorting through a stack of files, and Ms. Jacobs was arranging her notes on her desk nearby. "Good morning, Principal Turner, Ms. Jacobs," Mrs. Roberts said calmly but clearly with a purpose. "Good morning, Mrs. Roberts," responded Principal Turner, looking up to nod friendly. "How may we help you today?" Mrs. Roberts took a deep breath, collecting herself. "I wanted to follow up on our discussion regarding Mia Johnson. I think she may need more support than just transportation, especially given her responsibilities at home. She's taking care of her sick mother and balancing her own education, and she has very few resources to fall back on. I really believe it is important for us to develop some kind of plan that would help her be successful, both academically and personally." Principal Turner and Ms. Jacobs exchanged a look as they sat forward in their chairs, listening more attentively to her. Ms. Jacobs spoke first. Her tone was soft and calm. "I agree, Mrs. Roberts. Since we have last spoken, I did some research and I think we have a few options. We might be able to arrange for tutoring or, at the very least, make sure she has access to resources like the library or after-school programs." Principal Turner frowned, his expression grave. We can also look into the possibility of having her referred to social services. If her mother is too ill to work, they might be eligible for some benefits that could ease Mia's load a little. Mrs. Roberts nodded hopefully. She was grateful that the administrative unit was at least willing to do something. I think that would make a world of difference for her. Mia is so dedicated, but she's carrying a tremendous weight. Anything we can do to ease her burden will help her focus on her education. Over the course of an hour, they planned how to get Mia on a positive track academically, as well as personally. Ms. Jacobs offered to organize a peer tutoring program, whereby one of their honor students could meet with Mia after school and assist her in catching up on her assignments. Principal Turner offered to call a nearby community center that had programs after school and may offer her a quiet place to study and other resources. Maybe we can give her a more formal support plan, Ms. Jacobs said, writing down notes as they were brainstorming. I can contact some of our local organizations and see if we can find a mentor for Mia or anyone else who could further support her outside of school hours. Mrs. Roberts listened to their ideas, her heart full of gratitude. She realized she wasn't pulling alone. Rather, the school was indeed invested in Mia's success, and she had people who really cared about her well-being. As they were finishing up, Ms. Jacobs smiled reassuringly at Mrs. Roberts. Thank you for bringing this to our attention, Mrs. Roberts. Your compassion for Mia has made all the difference here, and I'm sure she'll feel the impact of these changes. Thanks, Mrs. Roberts replied, her voice filled with emotion. I just want to make sure she knows she's not alone. Later that day, Mrs. Roberts waited until after class to speak in private with Mia, because she wanted to tell her the news of the extra support they had arranged and how this might make Mia feel relieved and motivated. As the students filed out, Mrs. Roberts called Mia over to her desk. Her tone was soft and full of purpose. Mia, could we talk for a moment? Mia nodded, with a little smile tugging at her lips as she leaned in closer. Mrs. Roberts knew that she was starting to feel safe and confident with her, but her eyes still reflected a deep wariness, as if she was still adjusting to the idea that someone really was in her corner. Mia, Mrs. Roberts started off, making sure to be careful with her choice of words. I know you have a lot on your plate. Let me reassure you that we have arranged some additional support for you here at school and outside. You will still have transportation, of course, but we are also working on hooking you up with a tutor and additional resources. It was then that Mia's eyes went just a bit wider, with the look of surprise upon her face. You mean I can get help with my schoolwork? Mrs. Roberts nodded and smiled warmly. Yes, you'll have someone who can work with you after school to make sure you don't fall behind. And if you ever need a quiet place to study, there are places here and at the community center that you can go to. You won't be carrying everything on your own anymore, Mia. You'll have people to lean on. Mia just stood and said nothing, trying to get her mind to understand what Mrs. Roberts was saying. She stared at the marble floor as her fingers clutched the edge of her notebook while trying to process the weight of Mrs. Roberts's words. A mix of relief and disbelief crossed her face. It was as if receiving this much support was a concept she had never dared to think of. I don't know what to say, Mia finally whispered when her voice could come out from a throat choked with emotion. Thank you, Mrs. Roberts. I never thought that someone would do something like this for me. Mrs. Roberts leaned forward, placing a soft hand on Mia's shoulder. Mia, you deserve this. You work so hard, and you are much stronger than any 16-year-old I know. This is not just about school. It is about making sure you will be okay and that you have what you need. You are not alone. Mia nodded. A small, grateful smile slipped through her reserved expression. She blinked on the tears that managed to well in her eyes, and her gaze took on a soft tone as she looked toward Mrs. Roberts with a newfound sense of trust. "Thank you," she whispered again, her tone low and barely audible. I just don't know what to say to show how grateful I am." Mrs. Roberts smiled, her heart full. "Just keep being the remarkable person you are, Mia. That is thanks enough." Over the next few days, Mrs. Roberts watched Mia slowly settle into the new routine, making do with what was now available to her. Since the daily transport was now provided, Mia would arrive at school right on time, and her mornings were no longer spent on that very long, exhausting walk. She was starting to become better rested. Her eyes were not as cloudy from exhaustion, and she started to pay more attention in class. Mrs. Roberts also noticed how helpful the tutoring sessions were. Mia's assigned tutor, a senior named Angela, who was diligent yet kind. She met several times a week with Mia to help get her caught up on assignments and strengthen her confidence. Angela seemed to genuinely enjoy the sessions as Mrs. Roberts noticed Mia began to open up. Shy smiles and giggles were even shared during their study sessions. But these changes didn't stop at the academic. Mia began interacting with her classmates more comfortably, occasionally joining them at lunch or chatting with Eliza, who was now a friendly presence in her life. The once invisible walls around Mia were slowly coming down, piece by piece, as she grew more and more comfortable with the support surrounding her. One afternoon, as Mrs. Roberts was getting ready to head out for the day, she saw Mia standing at her classroom door with a small folded paper clutched in her hands. A mixture of excitement and nervousness crossed Mia's face, and Mrs. Roberts raised an eyebrow, curious. "Mia, is everything all right?" Mrs. Roberts said kindly. Mia nodded, handing her the paper with shaky hands. "I just wanted to give you this. It's a thank you note. I didn't know how else to show you how grateful I am." Mrs. Roberts unfolded the note and read the words that were neatly written inside. "Dear Mrs. Roberts, thank you for everything you've done for me. I had never thought that anyone could care about my life outside of school, or notice how hard some things have been going. You have shown me I am not alone, and there are people out there who truly want to help. I will never forget your kindness, and I hope someday I will be able to do for another what you have done for me. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. With thanks, Mia." Mrs. Roberts felt the lump well up in her throat as she finished reading. She didn't know when the tears dropped on the piece of paper she was holding. She reached out toward Mia now, her heart full of pride and affection for this young girl who had endured so much and shown such resilience. "Thank you, Mia," she whispered, drawing the girl into a soft hug. "This means more than you'll ever know." Mia wrapped her arms tightly around her in return. For the first time, Mrs. Roberts felt that Mia actually believed in the support around her and understood she had people who actually cared for her. Later that evening, Mia sat on the small, worn couch in her living room while the sounds of the neighborhood dimmed into the quiet of the night. Her mother was asleep in the adjoining room, her light breathing the only sound filling the small house. It was one of the rare moments when Mia had felt the presence of peace, a quiet she had learned to savor. She looked down at her hands, calloused from daily chores she had grown so accustomed to cooking, cleaning, working at the local grocery store, and managing household chores, all while helping her mom with medication and personal care. Sometimes, when she looked at her hands, she often wondered how they'd grown so rough and tired at such a young age. She always felt that she looked a little bit older than her years. As she sank into the sofa, her mind drifted to thoughts of her father, a man she had not thought about in a very long time. The memories were foggy, almost like trying to look through a smudged window. He'd been a quiet man with a gentle smile and hands that were always busy, either fixing something around the house or making toys for her when she was little. But with time, it had all changed. His smiles grew rare, his shoulders fell, and one day he didn't come back. Mia had never asked her mother for details. She was too young to understand, and by the time she was old enough, she could see her mother was carrying enough pain without reliving it. So, Mia had learned to accept it, to take on what her mother couldn't do herself, to be the strength they both needed. So, she never asked about her father. As she let herself fall back into her seat, eyes closing, her mind went to the memory of herself at 6 years old. It was one of those rare, sun-filled Saturdays, and he had taken her down to that tiny park just a few blocks away. She still remembered how his laughter had been filled with so much happiness as he pushed her on the swings, his face so lit up with joy. "Higher, Daddy! Higher!" she squealed, her tiny arms reaching for the sky as she flew back and forth. Her father had laughed, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You'll fly away if I push any higher," he had teased, and Mia had giggled, feeling like the luckiest girl in the world. Those moments of pure happiness had been short, all the more precious to her memory now, and painful, knowing they were bound not to last. Then, with her mother's failing health, she could not remember the last time she had laughed. Like, really laughed. Her father had left, and he had carried with him all the joy that usually filled their home, leaving only silence. A year after he left, Mia's mother was diagnosed with a degenerative condition. It was an illness that slowly crept in and just as slowly changed a strong mother into a helpless one who needed Mia almost for everything. The neighbors and some relatives tried to help. They stopped over now and then with groceries, or at least offered to take Mia to school. But it wasn't too long before such visits trickled down till it stopped entirely till Mia and her mother were on their own. Mia had learned quickly that nothing was sure in life. Promises didn't always last, and she had to depend on her own strength. At 14, Mia grasped responsibilities that many adults could only imagine. Her days began well before the breaking of dawn, mornings filled with the meticulous preparation of her mother's breakfast and medications, dressing her and making sure she was comfortable before leaving for school. Even after the transportation offer from the school, Mia still struggled with all the duties she had to perform every morning before she could leave for school. She felt the ache of these routines, but she'd learned to carry them silently, with a resilience that had become a second skin. She had grown accustomed to the loneliness that came with her responsibilities. There was no one her age who could understand a world like hers. No one she felt comfortable confiding in. She once tried sharing a fragment of her life with an old friend, wanting to connect with someone. Her friend's reaction had been a mix of pity and discomfort. Her reaction made Mia more determined to suffer in silence, erecting barriers to protect her from further judgment. Though Mrs. Roberts' kindness had broken through some of those walls, it was hard for Mia to let herself fully trust. After all, promises of help were too fleeting, and people were sure to let you down. But as she remembered Mrs. Roberts' apology the other day, and how the school had made efforts to support her, a small glimmer of hope flickered inside her, a hope she had buried, but couldn't quite quench. Sometime in the quiet of the evening, Mia felt the loneliness weigh her down, an ache so deep that she could hardly explain it to herself. What she wanted was a friend, someone who would sit beside her, listen, and give her a friendship that needed no words. Often, she thought of Eliza, the classmate who invited her to sit at lunch, but she knew that Eliza's kindness and gentle disposition were too small to break down her barriers. On most days, she kept to herself, using the night when everything was to go through what had happened during the day. Mia loved to journal, and her journal, a beat-up book tucked beneath her bed, held thoughts and dreams she spoke of to no one. The writing was her solace, how she translated and coped with the heavy burden she was carrying. She wrote of her hopes and dreams for the future, of her fears, and sometimes even of the loneliness, which had come to be an old, unwanted friend. In the confidentiality of her journal, Mia was finally able to dream of what could have been, a world in which her mother enjoyed good health and her father was still with them, and she could attend school without worrying about responsibilities and chores. At times, she wrote of how Mrs. Roberts inspired her dream to be a teacher, someone sensitive enough to notice the quiet struggle of others and quick to offer an outstretched hand when most would turn away. Mia had learned to garner strength in small, sometimes transient moments. The sun glaring through the window, the feel of her mother's hand in hers. Quiet goodness met sometimes in the most unexpected quarters. These moments were brief, but reminded her that beauty still existed in the world, even if most times and often it was hidden beneath layers of hardship. The support she had started to get at school started to somehow move something in her, like a light brightening from afar. The sessions of tutoring were more than academic reinforcement. It was how Mia managed to find a sense of normality, the one moment in time when she could be free to enjoy her studies and do class assignments without the worry of what lay ahead at home. Angela, her tutor, had turned into someone Mia could look forward to seeing, a friendly face who didn't ask too many questions about her life, but nevertheless always supported her with encouraging words. And then there was Mrs. Roberts, whose words had given Mia a strength she hadn't known she needed. With every kind word from Mrs. Roberts, Mia felt the cracks in her walls grow a little wider, her heart letting in a little more trust, a little more hope. She was starting to believe that just maybe there actually were people who cared, people who would not leave her, who would not break their promises. She sat in this dimly lit room, attempting to think of a future, something brighter than the struggles she had grown accustomed to. Mrs. Roberts' belief in her had planted a sense of determination, a quiet resolve that hardened day by day. She wanted to make her mother proud, to prove to herself that she was capable of rising above her circumstances. Mia glanced toward her mother's room, the soft rhythm of her mother's breathing drawing her attention. To Mia, her mother had always been that reservoir of strength in life, more so even when she was ill. It taught her that resilience was something more similar to a way of life, rather than just one characteristic. It was a necessity that could carry you through the darkest of days. She silently vowed to carry that strength forward by doing everything in her power to persevere through her challenges and create a future that honored everything her mother had done for her. As Mia fell asleep that night, she felt this growing sense of purpose in her. The future wasn't bleak anymore. It was still something she wasn't yet sure about. However, for the first time in a very long while, she allowed herself to believe it was something worth fighting for. With Mrs. Roberts and the school supporting her, Mia began to glimpse a flicker of possibility, an opportunity to dream, the opportunity for a life during which she would be able to pursue goals without weighted handicaps from the hardships she had endured. Naturally, this was not easy. Mia knew that days of struggle would still be part of her life. For now, though, she clung to the hope that things could be different. The kindness from Mrs. Roberts and the school was all she needed to move forward, lighting the path to a future she was determined to forge. Mia was still getting used to the new rhythm in her life. Her morning walk had come to an end, and she was enjoying the school-arranged car that now pulled up outside her house. The first day the car had showed up, she had felt a well of emotion she couldn't quite put into words. Relief and gratitude mixed with just a hint of disbelief as she'd climbed into the back seat, watched her familiar street pass by through the window. Every school day, she was sure of a cheerful morning smile from Mrs. Roberts, accompanied by some words to keep her ready for the day's lessons. She could feel the sincerity in Mrs. Roberts' acts of kindness, one of those small, soft reminders that she wasn't completely alone. Mia was still finding it difficult to believe the whole concept of anyone taking care of her. But with each passing day, it became more believable that the love and kindness she was getting would not vanish into thin air. Another comforting presence was that of her tutor, Angela. The patience and understanding she gave during sessions were so beautiful to Mia. She found it easy to ask her questions or work out new concepts without feeling any sense of judgment. Angela actually appeared to enjoy the sessions. Her voice was always light and encouraging as she guided Mia through each problem. One afternoon, after a math problem that had been particularly frustrating, Angela set her pencil down and smiled across the table at Mia. "You know, Mia, you're really smart. You catch on so quickly." Mia felt a glow spread from the compliment. Her cheeks burned red from the compliment. She wasn't used to praise, and this compliment felt like a high treasure of validation. "Thanks," Mia replied with a soft voice, a coy smile breaking through the wall that normally guarded her. "I never thought that I was going to be able to understand math as I have now." Angela nodded in encouragement. "It is all about practice and having the right support. And now that you have that, there is nothing that you can't achieve." Those words stayed with Mia, ringing in her head as she was driven back home that day. The idea of there being no limit to the possibility of reaching her potential was a reality she had never considered. For the first time, she began to see that she was indeed capable and could build a life outside of the difficulties that had built boundaries for her so far. Over the next weeks, Mia found herself settling into this new routine. The transportation meant she had more time in the morning, never having to rush through her responsibilities at home. She could assist her mom with time, make breakfast, and make sure everything was in place before leaving for school. Her mornings were not overwhelming anymore, and hence, she could reach school with an active mind and then concentrate on her lessons. The academic support from Angela was also starting to bear fruit. Mia's grades were looking better. She no longer felt like she was drowning in uncompleted assignments and misunderstood concepts. Rather, she felt like she had her courses under control for the first time in quite a while. Mrs. Roberts never forgot to ask how Mia was feeling. She tried to gently explain every concept in the classroom properly for her. She would turn frequently during lessons, asking subtly if Mia understood the problem being solved. Mia listened to these gestures with gratitude. She knew Mrs. Roberts actually cared, and it felt so good to know that someone was watching her back. Mia started to open her mind to the fact that she deserved this support and was worthy of the kindness and resources extended to her. It was not an easy transition to make after years of self-sufficiency. It was hard to unlearn. But with each passing day, she felt her defenses soften and her confidence grow. It was like a sense of possibility was blooming within her. One of the most unexpected changes was in the relationship Mia had with her classmates. With the stability that she finally had, she no longer felt quite so alone or secluded from the world around her. Eliza continued to invite her to lunch, and Mia slowly found herself opening up, laughing at Eliza's jokes, even sharing small stories about herself. She made sure not to say too much, but she found the small moments refreshing. In one afternoon class for a group project, Mia was assigned to work with Eliza and Adam, the same boy who once belittled her for being late. She prepared herself for his usual sarcasm, but to her astonishment, Adam nodded in greeting. His tone was unusually respectful. "Hey, Mia," he said as they sat down at the table. "I heard you're rocking it lately in math. That's cool." Mia blinked, feeling shocked. Was this the same guy she remembered? She gave him a small smile, feeling uncertain of what to say. "Thanks, Adam." Throughout the project, to her surprise, Adam was very supportive, even offering to share his notes and ask for Mia's opinion on a few questions. For the first time, Mia felt like part of the group, and it was as if her contributions truly mattered. At the end of the project, She had a sense of friendship that she felt hadn't really happened in years. One afternoon after class, Mrs. Roberts called Mia over to her desk. The classroom was empty, and the late afternoon light streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the rows of desks. Mia went over to her desk, a little flutter in her chest as she wondered what Mrs. Roberts might want to speak about. "Mia," Mrs. Roberts began, the tone of her voice warm. "I just wanted to say how proud I am of you, how much hard work I've seen you put in, how dedicated you really are. You have come a long way, and it shows." Mia's eyes welled with tears at the praise. Her eyes lit up with bright emotion. "Thank you, Mrs. Roberts. I never thought I'd be able to keep up like this." Mrs. Roberts nodded, a solemn look on her face. "You have shown so much strength, Mia. But do remember, you do not have to do everything on your own. It is okay sometimes to lean on others. There is a whole world of people who care about you and who want to see you succeed." Mrs. Roberts' words sank in gradually, the quiet truth Mia hadn't allowed herself to believe. Growing up, she believed she had to be the tough one. Accepting help only made her weak. In Mrs. Roberts' words, Mia found an understanding that strength could mean knowing when to lean on others. "Thank you, Mrs. Roberts," Mia whispered, full of gratitude, "for everything." Smiling, Mrs. Roberts leaned in close. "You've earned this, Mia. Keep believing in yourself. You're capable of doing wonderful things." That night, as Mia lay in bed, she thought about her future. For so long, her dreams had felt far away, stars in the night sky, but always just out of reach. Now they felt close, clear, and some way a little more possible. Mia thought of her love for learning, the spark of excitement she felt each time she understood a new concept or discovered the solution to a problem that had been trying her patience. She thought of Mrs. Roberts' words and Angela's patience. They had helped her find herself at a time when she didn't know who she was anymore. For the first time in her life, Mia started to picture herself as someone who could do it all. She saw herself taking the role of a teacher and being like Mrs. Roberts, who could look through the silent struggles of her students to reach out and touch hearts. As she closed her eyes that night, she let herself hold on to that little dream. This support Mia had received meant so much to her. It was a lifeline, or better still, some kind of bridge to the future that she could now envision. Sure, she knew that the path ahead would not necessarily be easy, but she also knew she had people around her who believed in her, who saw her worth even when she couldn't. The days that followed were brighter, punctuated with moments of growth and quiet victories. Mia continued to work hard, her confidence growing with each passing week. She welcomed the tutoring sessions with Angela, challenging herself academically, and she relished the time she spent talking with Mrs. Roberts, taking solace in the comfort of someone who truly cared. Things also began to blossom with her peers. Eliza became a real friend, inviting her to study sessions and lunches. Even Adam, who had teased her relentlessly before, was now respectful toward Mia, recognizing her strengths and not her weaknesses. Mia's life began to change slowly. She no longer let her hardships define her. Instead, she could feel a growing sense of possibility, a belief that her future was hers to shape. The support she had gotten had shown her she was not alone and that people wanted her to succeed. It was proof that she had within her more than enough strength to do great things. For the first time in years, Mia was going to school every morning with quiet confidence. She no longer needed to shrink into the background or avoid eye contact with her classmates. She was confident in herself and her abilities. As the days went by, the warmth of Mrs. Roberts' greeting, the encouraging words from Angela, and even the small smiles and nods from her peers began to feel more natural to her. She had gotten so used to being alone and handling things on her own that the love and attention had been strange at first. But beneath the guards and walls she had up, a subtle but sure change was underway, and it was bringing down all the walls she had so painstakingly built about herself. Mia usually dreaded lunchtime because she had to sit alone on a bench without any friends, but recently she would sit with Eliza and a few other classmates. The cafeteria was no longer an intimidating place with the silent pressure of isolation. If not for anything, it was now one of the places Mia could feel safe. She and Eliza would chat about assignments, share inside jokes, and even daydream about the future from time to time. Moments like this, simple as they were, had within them a warmth Mia once thought would never be accessible to her. One day, over lunch together, Eliza leaned in close. Her voice was soft. "You know, Mia, you've really inspired me. Just the way you keep pushing forward, even when things get hard. It's amazing." Mia felt her cheeks get warm as she lowered her gaze to avoid Eliza's eyes. She was not used to such overt admiration. "Thank you, Eliza," she whispered. "I guess. I just try my best to get past each day. I basically have no clue as to what I'm doing." "Well, you're doing more than just getting by," Eliza said with a grin. "You're thriving, and I'm proud to be your friend." Long after lunch was over, the words remained in Mia's head. She hadn't exactly thought of herself as anyone who could be someone's friend, talk more of being someone's inspiration. But with Eliza's words, Mia began to wonder if maybe she was tougher than she had ever realized. As the days went by, Mia's academic performance also kept on improving. Her improvements were so impressive that most teachers were shocked at what was happening. Mrs. Roberts was the first teacher to take note of her academic improvement. She noticed that Mia raised her hand more often now in class. Her confidence grew with each correct answer, and she valued her contribution to the discussion. Her once quiet voice had grown steady, filled with a silent strength that her classmates couldn't help but respect. Even Adam, who had been mean earlier, now seemed to look at her in another light. Working on one of their many projects, he leaned over once, looking at her notes with an interested grin. "Mia," he said, nodding at her work, "you're really good at this. I mean, you're pretty much the brains of this whole operation." Mia laughed, breaking through her normally cold expression into a thin smile. "Thanks, Adam. I guess it just takes practice." He nodded, still staring at her work. "Maybe I need to take a leaf from your book then. That's a commitment I could use." The respect in Adam's voice caught Mia off guard, filling her with a sense of accomplishment. She welcomed these feelings, but she knew it was going to take time for her to get used to it. She felt the hard work she had been putting in was not only helping her grades, but also the way people saw her. For the first time, she did not feel like an outsider because she didn't try to fit in. She felt seen because she was being herself, and that was one of the best feelings ever. With each new development in her relationships with her schoolmates, Mia continued to grow confident, and she started coming out of her shell. She also found herself getting closer to Mrs. Roberts. There was this beautiful understanding that seemed to exist between them, a connection that went well past the ordinary teacher-student relationship. Mia felt comfortable being able to confide in her, and Mrs. Roberts had grown to be a constant presence in her life, a source of advice and encouragement. Mrs. Roberts was a mother, so with every new achievement and new feat Mia achieved, it felt like her child was succeeding too. That afternoon, after class was over, Mrs. Roberts called Mia to her desk with a warm smile. "Mia, do you have a moment? I wanted to talk." Mia nodded, heading to the front of the room. She felt a flutter of anticipation, wondering what Mrs. Roberts wanted to discuss. Mrs. Roberts waved at her to take a seat, her eyes warm, shining bright with pride. "Mia, I wanted to tell you how very, very proud I am of you. The progress you have made and the strength you have shown are really inspiring. I know that it hasn't been easy, but you have faced everything with such grace." A lump formed in Mia's throat as her eyes misted a little. She wasn't exactly the type that banked on praise, but such words coming from someone she had an insane amount of respect for managed to make her feel warm, a feeling which she just could not explain. "Thank you, Mrs. Roberts," Mia said softly. I don't know where I'd be without your support. You've given me so much hope, and it's something I never thought I'd experience." Mrs. Roberts leaned forward, placing a gentle hand on Mia's shoulder. "Mia, I want you to know that strength has always been within you. All I did was remind you of that, and I hope you know there is a bright future waiting ahead for you. Whatever your dreams are, do not be afraid to pursue them." Mia nodded. Her heart swelled with this newfound sense of purpose. Dreaming of the future and what it could bring was something she had never dared dream of till recently. But the more she listened to Dr. Roberts, the more reachable her dreams seemed. As the weeks went by, Mia's self-belief continued to grow. She found herself thinking more and more about her future, daring to imagine a life beyond the limitations she'd once seen as inevitable. She began working out a plan and establishing small goals for herself, goals that, despite sounding simple, marked a significant shift in how she saw herself. In her quiet moments, Mia would sometimes indulge in fantasies of what it might be like to graduate, to go to college, or even to be a teacher one day. The thought excited her and brought a feeling she hadn't been able to associate with her future with till recently. Though the path ahead still felt difficult, Mia was no longer afraid to take it and see what life had in store for her. She was certain about her resilience, her own strengths, and the unwavering support of people who believed in her. Along with academic successes, Mia's relationships with her peers continued to evolve. Eliza really became a friend, not because she sat with Mia out of charity, but because she genuinely enjoyed her company. They began to spend time out of school with each other, studying in the library or simply sitting and chatting over lunch as their laughter filled the quiet spaces between them. One afternoon, while they were working on an assignment together, Eliza suddenly smiled at Mia. "You know, I'm really glad we became friends," she said. "I used to think that you're so quiet because you never wanted to talk to anyone, but now I get it. You're just strong in your own way." Mia's cheeks warmed and a shy smile worked its way onto her face. "Thanks, Eliza. I'm really glad too. I've just never really had any friends before talk more of someone amazing like you." Eliza nudged her playfully. "Well, you've got me now, and I'm not going anywhere. You're stuck with me." Mia laughed heartily for the first time in a really long time. The laughter carried real and genuine warmth. In that moment, she felt a connection that she didn't know was even possible. A feeling of home and safety that transcended friendship. The silent understanding that she was seen and liked and accepted for who she was. With each passing day, Mia's world was getting bigger, and she was becoming stronger. Her relationships with friends and family, school success, and the infallible support of Mrs. Roberts and Angela were a bedrock she could always rely on. Her burdens no longer defined her life, and neither did circumstances bind her. She felt empowered as if her future was finally within her grasp. It was getting dark, and from the window the sun slowly set behind her neighborhood. Mia allowed herself to dream of the future, a future where she could continue her education, pursue her passions, and maybe even be of help to other people who have gone through the same hardship she was going through. What had once been a faraway dream now seemed closer, more tangible, and Mia was determined to make them real. She knew that the journey ahead of her would be far from easy, but she wasn't afraid anymore. With her friends' support, her teachers, and the belief she found within herself, Whatever came next, she was ready. It was a beautiful Saturday morning, and Mrs. Roberts sat for the most part of it alone in her living room, the soft golden lamplight spilling warmly across the room. The house was quiet. She loved the quietness, a moment to pause and reflect. She had gotten used to the quiet after her daughters left for college. In the quiet, her mind strayed to Mia, to the remarkable journey that had brought them both to this place. She remembered the day she first noticed Mia's struggles, how late she was, how tired her eyes were, how her silence seemed like a mask for indifference. It was strange now to think that all this had frustrated her once. Now, a deep pang of regret over those early assumptions tinged with deep gratitude ate away at her concerning the lessons Mia had taught her. Mrs. Roberts sipped her tea as she focused on the family portrait lying on the table beside her. She found herself lost in thoughts over the past few months. Mrs. Roberts saw so much of her daughter in Mia, the resilience and willingness to suffer in silence without asking for help from people around you. But she was happy that just like her daughter, Mia was also learning to open up to those who really cared for her. It had been a journey of learning and growth, one that had shown her a new side of herself and reminded her just why she became a teacher in the first place. While teaching had always been her calling, somewhere along the line, routines and demands made her forget that the core of her occupation was a responsibility not only to nurture, but also to guide and really see each of her students, to be able to tell when any of them were going through a terrible situation or when they needed guidance. As Mrs. Roberts reflected, she realized that Mia's story opened her eyes in ways that went beyond just teaching. It had taught her the importance of empathy, of looking beyond her own assumptions, and really listening. Somewhere in her life, she had picked up a prejudice that had played a role in the reason why she had not reached out to Mia earlier. But so far, she had come to learn that there could be silent battles her students might be carrying, and there might be quiet struggles they fought each day just to keep up. Mia had taught her a lot and reminded her of things she had forgotten. Mrs. Roberts had come to know that there was often so much more to a person's story than met the eye. Mrs. Roberts remembered the day she had followed Mia home. She remembered how, for the first time, she had worked for miles till her legs hurt. She could still see the small, weathered house with the frail figure of Mia's mother in the window. That single experience had shattered her preconception then, and had left her feeling so humbled and ashamed. But in the days that had gone by since then, she had come to realize that while this experience was painful, it was a much-needed experience in her life. Thanks to that day, she had pushed herself to grow, to become more compassionate, and to broaden the meaning of what it meant to be a teacher. Mrs. Roberts let out a sigh as she placed her cup of tea down. She took a slow look around the room. Her heart was full of gratitude for her journey and where she was now. She now knew that to be a teacher went way beyond imparting knowledge. It was to be that steady presence, one where she had to be a pillar of strength and understanding, even if she didn't feel like it. She was grateful to Mia for having reminded her of that, for bringing back a part of herself that she had long forgotten about. As Mrs. Roberts continued reflecting, she felt a renewed sense of purpose fill her, a quiet determination to use the lessons she'd learned in everything in her life. She thought about the other students in her class, the bright and talkative ones, the shy and reserved ones, those who occasionally acted out, constantly trying to find new ways to get attention, or who always seemed distracted. She realized that each of them, in their own way, might be fighting a battle she couldn't see. But one thing was for certain. She was determined to approach each of them with the same compassion she had found for Mia. Over the next few days, Mrs. Roberts made it a point to spend a bit more time with her students, asking them about their weekends, their families, and their interests. She saw the light in their faces when she showed actual interest in them outside of academics. How one question could open a door into their life. It was a small act, one that was profoundly meaningful. One afternoon, after class, she found herself talking with Adam, a student who was notorious for teasing other students. Mrs. Roberts had noticed that he was always restless and fidgety. It was obvious that he masked his insecurities with jokes and sarcasm. As she initiated a deep conversation with him, she found out he was struggling with his own set of challenges, a difficult family situation, and pressure to live up to an older brother's success. He listened attentively to Mrs. Roberts as she dished out words of encouragement and reassurance. Mrs. Roberts could tell she hit the mark as she looked into his eyes as she spoke. There was this brief flicker of relief that crossed his eyes as if he finally felt someone was listening to him for the first time. Mrs. Roberts felt satisfied, knowing Mia had taught her something about how she approached each of her students. It wasn't good enough that she was teaching them, but she had the chance to nourish and connect with them, creating a haven where her students could thrive easily. A few days later, Mrs. Roberts found herself talking with Ms. Jacobs, the school counselor who had played a huge role in ensuring that Mia had daily transportation to school and that there was extra support at hand whenever she needed it. They sat in the staff room, taking a brief break between classes. Ms. Jacobs smiled warmly as she caught the reflective expression on Mrs. Roberts' face. "You look like you've been deep in thought," Ms. Jacobs commented, a hint of curiosity in her tone. Mrs. Roberts nodded, looking a distance away. "I have. This experience with Mia, it changed me. I used to think I was a compassionate teacher, but I realize now how much I had to learn." Ms. Jacobs nodded. A soft smile danced on her lips. "It's so easy to let those things slide when we're just trying to keep pace with what day-to-day requires of us. It seems Mia has been a gift to you, too, in her own way." Mrs. Roberts nodded, her face softening into a smile. "She really has. She's reminded me why I chose this path in the first place, of the responsibility I have to each of my students. I want to make sure none of them ever feel overlooked or unseen." Ms. Jacobs reached forward, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're doing a great job, Mrs. Roberts. The kids are in good hands." The words brought a quiet confidence to her being, a sense of vindication that seemed to warm her heart. She felt like she was ready to take on whatever her job threw at her. The whole incident exposed her to a fresh attitude that showed she had every power to make a real difference in the children's lives. One evening, Mrs. Roberts sat at her desk and stared at the blank sheet of paper in front of her. She needed to put her feelings into words. She didn't mind if it was against teacher-student relationships. She had to tell Mia how she had influenced her life. Taking a deep breath, she began to write. "Mia, dear, I just wanted to take a minute to thank my lucky stars for having met you. You've taught me more in these past months than I could ever hope to teach you. You've shown me what it means to be resilient, to face realities with grace, and to hold on to hope, no matter how bad things get. Your strength has inspired me, Mia, and I want you to know that you're capable of truly amazing things. You have in your heart a compassion unlike any other and a bright spirit. I have no doubt you'll continue to do wonderful things in life and go on to achieve wonderful things throughout your life. Thank you for reminding me of what teaching is all about, and thank you for showing me that sometimes it's the students who teach the most important lessons. I am so proud of you, and it's a privilege to take part in this journey. With all my admiration and respect, Mrs. Roberts." Mrs. Roberts folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope. She was going to give this to Mia after graduation so that she would remember all they shared and the bond formed between them. Of course, it was a strange gesture, but it conveyed depths of her appreciation and a promise of further support. As she put the letter aside, Mrs. Roberts felt a deep sense of fulfillment settle over her. The knowledge that this journey with Mia was one she'll carry in her heart forever and use for quiet strength whenever her role as a teacher seemed difficult. Mia had given her a gift. She had not known that she needed a reminder of the power of compassion, of how much of a difference one person could make in another's life. Mrs. Roberts glanced at the clock and knew it was about time to start putting things away for the lessons the next day. But as she began gathering her things together, a sense of purpose washed over her, that her calling was far more than a job. It was a calling, an opportunity to make a difference one student at a time. She knew without a doubt in her mind that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. It was a cold, rainy morning. Mia came to school on the school bus. She had since gotten used to it, and her life had become easier. Even the heavy weight she had to bear seemed to be lighter these days. She had let go of the pang of isolation and the exhaustion that usually followed her days like a dark cloud. She had truly evolved into a confident, even joyful girl. Mia could now easily walk through the busy hallway, nodding to classmates who smiled and said hello. This was a striking contrast to the same girl who was once looked down on, the same girl who had felt invisible. Everything was different now. She was starting to feel seen and valued. They had a big math test day coming up, and Mrs. Roberts had every one of them jittery with excitement for the upcoming test. Mia seated herself on her front row and opened her notebook to a clean page with her pencil ready for the day's class. "All right, class," Mrs. Roberts said with a smile. "I can tell that you all are a bit jittery about tomorrow's test, but don't be. We have worked really hard, and I know that you are ready. Let's just handle some quick revision, and then you can ask any questions that you may have. That way, I can leave you guys to practice more in your free time." Mia raised her hand, and Mrs. Roberts nodded encouragingly to her. "Yes, Mia? Could you go over the quadratic formula again?" Mia asked. "I just want to make sure I've got it right." Mrs. Roberts smiled, nodding as she walked to the board. "Of course, it's a tricky one, but I know you'll get it." Mrs. Roberts explained the formula as her calm, reassuring voice took center stage in the silent classroom. Mia listened intently, jotting down notes, and observed how focused her classmates were on what was being discussed. It was good to belong to something, to be surrounded by people who were working together, each of them bringing their strengths and even weaknesses into the room. As the students filed out of the classroom after class, Mrs. Roberts caught Mia's eye to stay behind. Immediately, a spark of curiosity struck her as she wondered if she had done anything wrong. It had been days since they last spoke, and Mia couldn't think of any reason why she would be asked to stay back. Finally, they were alone, and Mrs. Roberts sat down next to Mia. She had a pensive look on her face. "Mia, I wanted to talk with you about something that has weighed heavily upon my mind," Mrs. Roberts said in a soft tone. Mia nodded, her stomach turning with a mix of anticipation and curiosity. "Okay." Mrs. Roberts took a deep breath. Her eyes were piercing and steady as they met Mia's. "I want to apologize to you, Mia. I know I said it before in various words, but there is something I want to clear up in the open. When I first noticed your lateness to class, I assumed things about you, things that were unfair, and I know now that part of my assumptions came from a place of prejudice, because I saw you as different, and I didn't take the time to see your full story." Mia's eyes widened with a look of surprise on her face. Mrs. Roberts continued, her voice full of remorse. "I was wrong to reprimand you in front of your peers, wrong to assume that when you fell behind, it was a matter of not trying hard enough, or not taking it seriously enough. I failed to see that you were carrying burdens that no kid your age should ever have to carry. And I know that all I did and all I said was filtered through my blind spots, through my assumptions about who you are as a young Black woman." Mia looked down, her eyes absorbing the words. She had not expected Mrs. Roberts to acknowledge such openness of her bias, and it made her feel some strange mix of emotions: relief, gratefulness, and a tinge of sadness for everything they had gone through. "Thank you for saying that, Mrs. Roberts," Mia quietly said in a steady voice. I didn't actually think of it like that, but hearing you say this means a lot. It's been hard having to hide so much of who I am and what I go through. But you've made a difference, and I think I'm finally starting to believe in myself and the people around me." Mrs. Roberts leaned forward, extending a hand to take Mia's in hers. "I promise I will do better, Mia, not just with you, but with all of my students. You have taught me more than you know about. I'm seeing lots of things from a different perspective, from being more compassionate to seeing people for who they are. I want to thank you for giving me a chance to learn and for allowing me to become a better person because of you." Mia smiled, her eyes soft with emotion. I think we both helped each other." Mrs. Roberts chuckled softly, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Yes, I believe we did. And Mia, I want you to know that I'll always be here for you, no matter what. Whatever dreams you have, whatever goals you set, I'll be here to support you every step of the way." Mia was overwhelmed with the feeling of gratitude and warmth that filled up her heart as she looked back at Mrs. Roberts. She knew that she wasn't alone. She knew there were people who believed in her and who wanted her to succeed. "Thank you, Mrs. Roberts," Mia said with more sincerity in her voice than she'd ever heard. "You helped me see I can be more than what I thought I could be. And I want to make you and everyone who believes in me proud." Mrs. Roberts smiled, giving Mia's hand a soft squeeze. "You already have, Mia. You already have." Over the next weeks, Mia continued to live the best version of her life. She found that her confidence grew with each step. Her grades were exceptionally impressive, and she continued working with Angela and even joined a study group with Eliza and a few other classmates. The future began to look brighter, and her dreams seemed closer. She had promised herself that she was going to achieve everything she wanted, and now it felt like it was something she could accomplish easily. The next day, Mia opened the front door expecting to find the school bus, but to her surprise, it was Mrs. Roberts. She had called the school to tell them she would bring Mia in today. Mia greeted her and got into the car, leaning her head against the window as they passed the street. "Mrs. Roberts?" Mia asked in a way that suggested she was deep in thought. "Yes, Mia? I think I want to be a teacher someday," Mia whispered. "Just like you." Mrs. Roberts' eyes widened just a bit before a smile spread across her face. "Mia, that's great. You'd make an amazing teacher." Mia shrugged, her face turning red. "I don't know. I just think it would be nice to be there for someone the way you were for me, to help people the way you helped me." Mrs. Roberts nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "Then you should go for it, Mia. You have already proven that you have the heart, strength, and compassion. That's the kind of teacher the world needs." Mia smiled, this sense of purpose welling in her chest. She had found a new path, a new dream, and she was ready to walk it with all the strength she had. As they pulled up to the school, Mia turned to Mrs. Roberts, her expression serious but warm. "Thank you, Mrs. Roberts," she said, the gratefulness now dripping from her voice. "For everything. You've changed my life." Mrs. Roberts' eyes watered as she gazed at Mia, her heart swollen with pride and love. And you, Mia, have changed mine. Never forget how remarkable you are. I'm so proud of you. I never asked how you know where I live, Mia asked. Mrs. Roberts broke out in a smile. That's a story for another day, my dear. With one last smile, Mia gathered her things and stepped out into the car, walking toward the school building with her head held high. Though she still had several challenges she had to surmount, she was ready for them. She was armed with the love of those who had believed in her through and with strengths she found within herself. As Mrs. Roberts watched Mia walk away, she felt a deep sense of peace that overwhelmed her. It was one of those feelings that somehow managed to elude words. She knew this was only the beginning of Mia's story, the beginning for this young girl who once had felt so invisible. But now she had stepped into a future full of possibility and hope. At that moment, Mrs. Roberts knew that she too had grown, that she had learned as much from Mia as Mia had learned from her. It was a reminder that teaching was more than just a job. It was a calling, a call to touch lives and build futures, one student at a time.